It's the summer of 1953, and New York high society is in a flap. One of the city's most famous and beloved residents has gone missing, and no one has a clue where he is. He's a socialite and a model who's so in demand he's toured Europe and travelled the world. He's been featured in Vogue, appeared regularly on TV talk shows, being the host of one at one point, and even served as a goodwill ambassador to Cuba and Haiti. And now he's making headlines for all the wrong reasons, having disappeared into thin air. Thousands of flyers have been distributed, and police across 13 states have been searching for him, but to no avail. He was last seen in May, walking out of a luxury shop in Midtown Manhattan alongside an unknown woman, and no one has seen or heard from him since. It's widely believed that he was the victim of a kidnapping, but no ransom note has been received, and despite multiple rewards being put forward for his safe return, no questions asked, not a single person has come forward with information on the missing poodle. Oh, yeah, did I not mention? The missing celebrity is a dog. More specifically, he's a stunning little toy poodle with luxurious grey fur clipped into his own unique style. He's said to be the most famous, most valuable dog in the world, and his name is Pulaski's masterpiece. But, okay, let's step back for a second and ask ourselves a question. What the hell is going on? Why is this dog so famous, and how did someone manage to steal him? Well, to tell the story of Pulaski's masterpiece in its entirety, we have to start with the Pulaski part of his name, and that means going back even further to the mid-1920s, when a 30-year-old Russian immigrant arrived on the shores of the US, having fled his home country after the Communist Revolution. His name is Count Alexis Pulaski. He was a tall, handsome man who simply oozed charisma and charm. Blessed with European pretension and a silver tongue to match his silver hair, Pulaski easily found himself a place in New York high society, which I suppose is only fitting given that he was a count. Except, well, he wasn't. Sure, he told everyone that he was, and he certainly went around with the airs of European nobility, but in reality, he was just some guy. Some random bloke who told people he was a count, and seemingly everyone just believed him. Apparently, his immigration records had his name down as Alexis Count Pulaski. It looks like he just gave it to himself as a middle name, so he could swap them round and pretend he had a title. From what I can tell, Pulaski was just that kind of guy. He liked a tall tale, especially if it made him sound more grandiose than he actually was. And I suppose lying about your identity is certainly one way to be accepted by the upper classes. And it wasn't just titles he made up. Apparently he also told people that he had once been the personal groom to President Roosevelt's pet dog. So, yeah, Pulaski was, well, let's be nice. Let's call him a storyteller. And while he may have enjoyed a fabrication or 2 or 12, there was one thing about Pulaski that no one could deny, and that was that he absolutely adored dogs. In his early 20s back in his native Russia, he'd been a relatively successful breeder and shower of Doberman pinschers, as well as photographer and dog groomer. But it seems that for his first 5 or 6 years in the US, he took a step back from the dog fancy. I suppose he was too busy working his way up New York City's social ladder. But once he'd been fully accepted into the upper echelons of society, Pulaski once again turned his attention back to the world of dog showing. But this time it wasn't Dobermans that caught his fancy. No, instead, it was a very different breed, the dainty little toy poodle. Pulaski's passion for poodles, try saying that 5 times fast, was born in 1939, when he dog sat for his friend Gilbert Kahn, who, from what I can tell, was the son of a successful investment banker. For whatever reason, Kahn's poodles caused Pulaski to fall completely in love with the breed, so much so that he would dedicate the rest of his life to them. And so Pulaski dove headfirst into the world of toy poodle breeding and showing. Not only that, but he even purchased a property in Midtown Manhattan that had once been a famous speakeasy, and converted it into his newest business venture, Poodles Incorporated. From the name of it, you might assume that Poodles Inc. was just a place for him to sell his poodle puppies, and that was certainly one thing he did, but Poodles Inc. was so much more than that. Poodles Inc. sold everything the discerning poodle parent might need, provided they had the money for it. They sold accessories and furniture for small dogs, all unbeaten for quality and luxury, as well as for price. This was a pet shop only for society's elites, for the upper crust who could afford to sink a small fortune into their pampered poochers. And that wasn't all that was on offer at Poodles Inc. It was also a high-end dog grooming salon and a boarding kennel. Everything you could possibly need for your poodle, all under one roof. And it wasn't just the products on sale that lent to this air of exclusivity and opulence. That was an atmosphere that Pulaski very deliberately cultivated, from the decor to the staff to the occasional live harpist playing softly in the background. Yeah, this was the kind of place that I'd honestly be scared to even step into for fear of being immediately outed as an unworthy peasant. But for those who are rich enough to shop here, it became almost like an elite social club. And one of the shop's main draws, aside from the actual products, was the fact that Pulaski's poodles were just in there milling about, greeting and entertaining the customers. Pulaski was really proud of the fact that his dogs were well trained enough that they could be trusted to have free reign of the premises without the need for leads, cages or pens. While it's clear that Pulaski adored all of his poodles, there was one that stole his heart like no other, a little grey puppy who was born on the 4th of August 1946. I mean, I say little, he was actually the largest of the litter, but I mean, he was also a toy poodle, so. And it seems that from the moment he was born, this dog became the absolute apple of Pulaski's eye. He just instantly fell in love with him. I know next to nothing about the world of dog showing, so I don't know how early you can tell whether or not a puppy has the potential to succeed in that kind of thing. But it seems that from pretty much the word go, Pulaski was convinced that this puppy was the best he'd ever bred, the pinnacle of all his hard work. This was his masterpiece. And I mean that literally. I'm sure you've already guessed, but if not, this dog was indeed the one who had come to be named Pulaski's masterpiece. I mean, I really don't blame you if you'd even forgotten that this episode is about Pulaski's masterpiece and not just Pulaski, but we finally reached the point in Masterpiece's story where Masterpiece actually appears. Pulaski was utterly enamoured with Masterpiece, and was convinced that he had the potential to be one of the greatest show dogs of all time. It wasn't just down to his conformation either. It was his temperament, the way he carried himself, his charisma, his intelligence, his charm. He was everything Pulaski believed a poodle should be, the absolute pinnacle not only of his breed, but of his species. And so Pulaski carefully trained Masterpiece until he was finally ready to enter his first ever show in 1947. And they did not start small. Masterpiece's first entry was in the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show. I'm not into dog showing, and I'm obviously not American, but even I've heard of the Westminster Dog Show. Held annually every single year since 1877, even through 2 world wars, the Great Depression and the COVID pandemic, it's one of the biggest and longest running dog shows there is. It's basically the US equivalent of Crufts. So yeah, competing there is kind of a big deal, and I'm sure plenty of people would maybe want to start their dog off with something a little bit smaller, ease them into it gently. But Pulaski knew, just knew, that Masterpiece was destined for greatness, and so he didn't hesitate in throwing Masterpiece right into the deep end. Besides, the Westminster show was held in their own stomping ground of Midtown Manhattan, so to him it must have seemed the obvious choice. I mean, Masterpiece was only entered into a puppy class because he was, a puppy, but I feel like the Westminster puppy classes are probably still more intense than, say, a small local show, but Pulaski was still confident in his star's success. What is it they say about pride coming before a fall? Yeah, Masterpiece's first show did not go well. I couldn't find the exact results anywhere, so I don't know exactly where he placed, but he certainly didn't win. I don't think he even came close. It must have been a pretty crushing blow to old Pulaski, but there was something much, much worse looming on the horizon. Soon after the show, Masterpiece fell ill. Really ill. He had distemper, an illness he'd probably picked up from the Westminster show. Canine distemper virus is an awful disease. Often, the initial symptoms seem relatively innocent. Runny eyes, a bit of a cough, maybe some diarrhea. Then they become lethargic and lose their appetite, developing a fever. Their eyes go from watering to leaking pus. And then things get really bad as the virus begins to attack their internal organs. They start having fits and seizures, uncontrollable tremors, even paralysis. It's a disease with a high mortality rate, and even the small number of dogs who do survive are often left with permanent neurological damage and lifelong disability. It's an awful, awful illness, and to this day there's no cure for it. There aren't really even any proper treatments. It's often just a matter of trying to treat the symptoms and keep them stabilised while their body tries to fight the infection. Often that requires an expensive stay in a veterinary hospital, and even then there's no guarantee. What we do have now, though, that wasn't available in Masterpiece's time, is a highly effective vaccine. That's why pretty much all of us dog owners have never had to experience the horrors of distemper. Puppies are given a course of jabs when they're young that give them immunity. As you can imagine, Masterpiece was incredibly unwell, and for a while it really seemed that he wasn't going to make it. He ended up being sent to a kennel in New Jersey for an extended holiday, with the hopes that being away from the hustle and bustle of the city might help him to recover. And miraculously, Masterpiece survived. It took time, of course, but eventually he managed to fight off the virus, and even more amazingly, he was, by all accounts, left with no long-term effects afterwards. Maybe Pulaski was right. Maybe this dog really was something special. Eventually, Masterpiece found his way back into the show ring, and despite the awful start to his career, he soon began making a name for himself in the regional show circuit, eventually working his way up to the championship classes. In fact, he ended up with the 3 most prestigious titles there were, back to back. He wasn't the first dog to ever complete this hat trick, but he was the first toy dog, and by this point, Masterpiece was travelling across the US to compete. So Masterpiece had definitely made a name for himself in the world of dog showing, but a few show titles does not a celebrity make. Of course, he must have been popular in the circles of other breeders and handlers, but I mean, how many show dogs have you heard of? Probably none if you're not in that world. But Pulaski wasn't content for Masterpiece to be such a niche public figure. He wanted his dog to become a full-blown celebrity, and luckily for him, he had the gift of the gab and connections to New York City's elite, and oh my did he use them. Pulaski claims that when Masterpiece would travel to other American cities for shows, he would be thrown these elaborate welcome parties with up to 200 guests, half of whom were human and half were dogs. But, well, while there's no doubt that Masterpiece would indeed become a beloved public figure, and there definitely are verified accounts of people going wild for him, when we have nothing but Pulaski's word for something, I'd take it with a grain of salt. Pulaski had the soul of a showman, and as such, had a propensity for exaggeration, and maybe potentially just making things up. One thing we do know is that Pulaski would regularly hold cocktail parties at his apartment, which was located in the wealthy Manhattan neighbourhood of Upper East Side, and that these parties would be attended by all sorts of rich and influential people from around the world. And of course, the guest of honour at all of these parties would always be Masterpiece, where he would entertain the partygoers with his repertoire of tricks. Now, it's worth noting that Pulaski didn't actually approve of training dogs to do these kinds of pointless tricks. But this is Masterpiece we're talking about, so of course the usual rules didn't apply to him. He was special. Pulaski was utterly convinced that Masterpiece's mental faculties were far beyond that of any other dog. And to be fair, poodles are generally regarded as being one of the most intelligent dog breeds out there. But Pulaski believed that Masterpiece exceeded even the standards of his breed. He thought that Masterpiece needed mental enrichment because he was just so much cleverer than any other dog. It totally wasn't the same as someone teaching their dog to do something just because it was cute or would impress people. Besides, Pulaski wasn't actually the one who trained Masterpiece, oh no. Masterpiece, of course, required only the best, and that included his staff. Yes, Masterpiece had his own staff. One of them was a former lion tamer and circus trainer whose job it was to provide Masterpiece with private tuition. Masterpiece had a pretty broad repertoire of tricks that he'd show off to Pulaski's party guests. He made such a wide variety of noises that he could almost hold a conversation with you, and he could walk not only on his hind legs, but apparently also on his front legs. Not at the same time as he was walking on his hind legs though, obviously, that would just be regular walking. The trick Masterpiece became best known for though, was actually one of his most simple. If anyone asked him, "Are you a communist, Masterpiece?" he would respond by emphatically shaking his head, affronted that you could even suggest such a thing. It was through these parties that Masterpiece started to get a foothold in the world of mainstream celebrity. Everyone who met him was enamoured by him, and before long his puppies were being sold to celebrities such as Judy Garland and Eva Peron. And Masterpiece himself was becoming nothing short of a socialite. I know we all like to think of the whole influencer thing as a modern invention, but I honestly can't think of a more accurate way to describe Masterpiece at the height of his fame than a canine influencer. Of course his fame drew plenty of people into Poodles Inc., as it was said that every single product they sold was tested and approved by him, including Kennel No. 0, which was a perfume for dogs. But Masterpiece's influencing went far beyond his master's own products. He was also in high demand as a spokesdog, and model for any number of adverts. Clothing, accessories, fabric, even telephones. It's estimated that between his modelling work and his duties as a stud dog, Masterpiece could earn up to $11,000 in a year. That's the equivalent of about $150,000 in today's money. He was raking in so much cash that he literally had to have his own bank account. Speaking of money, one of the reasons Masterpiece made so much from being a stud dog was that he would supposedly refuse to mate with any female dog for less than $500, which today would be over $6,000. Apparently, if he was asked to, he'd shake his head to signal his refusal, according to Pulaski. Do we believe that this dog had such a well-developed concept of his own monetary value? Well, I can't speak on your behalf, but I mean, did anyone ever actually buy that? Like, did anyone actually just accept that as a concept? Or did they just, pretend that they did because they didn't want to upset Pulaski? I don't know, but wow. Masterpiece's fame soon grew beyond the boundaries of New York City, and then beyond the United States. He was in international demand, and so, of course, he simply had to begin travelling the world to further his career. He visited much of Western Europe, particularly France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and everywhere he went, he was met by adoring crowds. But of course Masterpiece couldn't travel the world alone. You might think that Pulaski travelled with him, given how much he worshipped his dog, but no, I guess he had more important things to do. Instead, Masterpiece's international jaunts would be accompanied by a woman named Lucy Copestake, who was employed as his travelling companion and chaperone. Since we've already met two of Masterpiece's staff members, the lion tamer turned dog trainer and Lucy, now seemed like as good a time as any to introduce you to the rest of his entourage. As well as those two, he also had a personal beautician who ensured that he was thoroughly pampered. Pulaski even devised a brand new version of the poodle cut for Masterpiece, as he felt the traditional continental one was too feminine. And Masterpiece also had his own bodyguard because of course he did. Apparently, Masterpiece would be prone to what were described as moody spells, probably the result of not being allowed to just be a dog. And when he was in one of these episodes, he'd go off his food, resulting in his bodyguard having to hand feed him until he came out of it. And the mental image of a big, burly, manly bodyguard tenderly hand-feeding a toy poodle and begging him to eat is pretty great, isn't it? Masterpiece's entourage was, of course, rounded off by Pulaski himself, who was basically his full-time agent. Masterpiece and Lucy's visits to Paris were a whirlwind of journalists and photographers, all eager to document this visit from the world's most famous and most valuable dog. Apparently, when he visited local dog shows, he would attract such large crowds that at least once he became so overwhelmed that the police had to be summoned to help him escape the torrent of adoring fans. Also, while in France, Masterpiece made the leap from modelling in photographs to modelling in person, when he strutted down the catwalk alongside a human model who was wearing a brand new piece from designer Marcel Rochard, an elegant grey woolen dress named after its inspiration, Masterpiece. But high fashion was nothing new for this dog. He'd already appeared in Vogue, and at home he had an entire wardrobe of custom-made outfits commissioned by Pulaski, which included a set of pyjamas, a bathrobe, and a raincoat. When the time finally came for Lucy and Masterpiece to return home, Air France put on a special farewell party for him at the airport's restaurant, where guests dined on a special menu which included an offering named after him. But Masterpiece's international trips didn't stop there. In 1953, he accompanied the US ambassador to Italy, Claire Booth Luce, on a trip there, alongside two of his children, Diego and Scusi. And he also travelled to Cuba as an ambassador of goodwill from the US, and to Haiti, whose government awarded him a gold medal. And Masterpiece's philanthropic streak didn't end with being an international ambassador of goodwill. He also attended and hosted plenty of charity fashion shows, raising money for everything from cancer patients to infantile paralysis. Yes, he was indeed a certified good boy. And while Masterpiece may have been a bit of a globetrotter, he was still in high demand at home. Pulaski would host these displays at Poodles Inc., where people would come and see Pulaski's finest poodles, with Masterpiece as the main draw, of course, luxuriating amongst finery, dignified and serene. During these kinds of events, Masterpiece would be in his travel case, although I don't think he was ever confined in it. Lined with red velvet, it was designed to look like an ornate picture frame, the kind that might surround a work by an old master, because, well, he was Masterpiece, so of course he had to be displayed like a masterpiece. At some of these events, Masterpiece would even have an armed guard stood on either side of the display just to be safe. One year, in the run-up to the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show, Masterpiece led a cavalcade of his peers from Poodles Inc. to a department store named Milgram's, where the dogs would then stay on display in the window for the rest of the week. The other dogs were all in a playpen in one window, but Masterpiece had a window all to himself, of course, reclining in his picture frame box. They were there to help advertise Milgram's new line of faux fur fashion, which had been inspired by the ever-increasing popularity of poodles, and Pulaski's poodles in particular. This particular event attracted so many adoring fans that, once again, police were called to help control the fervent horde. Yeah, I really can't stress enough just how famous Masterpiece was. It seemed that everyone knew and adored him. He was so popular that he even had a career as a talk show host. Well, a co-host. He had to have a human there with him because, well, an ability to talk is generally considered quite important for a talk show host. The show Masterpiece co-hosted was called Dog Show of Champions, and each week, Masterpiece and his human colleague would host special guests. Usually dogs, of course, but dogs from all walks of life. Guide dogs, working retrievers and greyhounds, a drill team of German shepherds, and a Great Dane who Masterpiece stole the spotlight from by leaping over him. And even outside of his duties as a host, Masterpiece was a regular guest on other talk shows too, sometimes in his own right and sometimes to work as a model, showing off all the latest fashions. Sometimes, though, it all seemed to get a bit much for Masterpiece, and he'd wander off to find himself some peace and quiet, away from the clamour of celebrity. Like I said, the dogs at Poodles Inc. were free to wander the store at will, because Pulaski felt they were well trained enough not to try and escape. And in particular, he felt that Masterpiece was so intelligent that he didn't really need any supervision, and Masterpiece would sometimes take advantage of that. The first time he escaped was when he was only about 9 months old, during that stint he had in New Jersey while he was recovering from distemper. He headed off into the forest alone, not reappearing again until 3 days later, when he brought himself back to the kennels where he was being kept, seemingly none the worse for his adventure. And a year or so after that, Masterpiece wandered out of Poodles Inc. while no one was watching him, and had a great time wandering the streets of New York, until he found himself in a linen shop on Park Avenue, where staff contacted the authorities who picked up Masterpiece and dropped him off back at Poodles Inc. Masterpiece was rumoured to be the most expensive dog in the world. Certainly that's what Pulaski claimed, but we'll never know exactly how much he could have sold for because Pulaski refused to ever part with him. Even when Prince Ali Khan of Pakistan supposedly offered over $20,000, looking to buy Masterpiece as a wedding gift for his bride Rita Hayworth, the love goddess herself. But Pulaski remained stalwart. Masterpiece was not for sale. And if you're wondering, that would have been the equivalent to over $250,000 in today's money. But you could have offered him all the money in the world, and Pulaski still wouldn't have parted with his Masterpiece. He may have been a bit of an eccentric, but his love for that dog was undeniable. Masterpiece was his everything. Which is why he was so surprised when, on the 29th of May 1953, he called Masterpiece to come and greet some customers at Poodles Inc., and Masterpiece didn't respond. So he called out to him again, and again there was nothing. Pulaski was immediately alarmed. This was totally out of character for Masterpiece, and so immediately a search was launched. Every inch of Poodles Inc. was scoured, but there was no sign of Masterpiece anywhere. He was gone. Masterpiece was reported missing to the police, but despite police departments across 13 states eventually being notified, nothing was ever found. There wasn't a shred of evidence. It was as if Masterpiece had simply vanished into thin air. Thousands of flyers were printed and posted across New York City and beyond, and volunteers gathered to help search for him, but again they found nothing. Pulaski would go on several TV shows, pleading for Masterpiece's safe return. He would often be accompanied by Just Johnny, who was a son of Masterpiece said to have an uncanny resemblance to his father. One of the shows they appeared on was the Dave Ganaway Show, which was one of the talk shows that Masterpiece used to frequent, and in fact his last appearance on it had come only a few weeks before he disappeared. The show included a reenactment, although curiously it showed Masterpiece being taken out of a cage, despite the fact that he was never caged at Poodles Inc. It could have been a miscommunication somewhere down the line, or perhaps Pulaski just didn't want people to think that he was an irresponsible dog owner. Either way, the show didn't lead to any new tips, or at least any that were considered credible. In fact, despite the extensive coverage that Masterpiece's disappearance received, there has only ever been one piece of evidence, one tip that's considered to be reliable. and that was a reported sighting of a glamorous dark-haired woman in a fashionable red coat stepping out of Poodles Inc. with a small grey dog at her heel, walking with her despite the fact that he wasn't wearing a lead. But that's it. There were no clues as to this woman's identity, and she never came forward. It's been over 70 years since Masterpiece disappeared, and we still don't know anything about what happened to him after he stepped out of the door of Poodles Inc. that fateful day in May 1953. A reward was put forward for Masterpiece's safe return, offering not only cash, but also one of Masterpiece's own sons, with the promise that no questions would be asked just so long as he was returned safe and well. All Pulaski wanted was his dog back, but it didn't work. If anyone out there had Masterpiece, they kept him hidden for the rest of his life. Masterpiece's son Just Johnny slipped into his father's role, working as a model for $25 an hour and being dubbed the most photographed dog in New York City. But he was never able to reach the same heights as his father. There would only ever be one Masterpiece. He was irreplaceable. 3 months after he went missing, on what should have been Masterpiece's 7th birthday, a party was held in his honour at Poodles Inc. For years after Masterpiece's disappearance, Pulaski would publish a monograph in his honour during the holiday season. For those who, like me, haven't heard of a monograph before, it's sort of halfway between an article and a book, too long to be the former and too short to be the latter. Pulaski made these claims that these monographs cost him thousands of dollars to make and print, but in reality he would type the manuscript up on his typewriter, make copies of it, and staple them together. Even the grief of losing his best friend wasn't enough to stop Pulaski's patter. These monographs were, of course, all about Masterpiece. His achievements, his life, anecdotes about him, and often would be written in first person from the perspective of Masterpiece. Poodles Inc. closed its doors in 1956, the year that Masterpiece should have turned 10. Pulaski was still deep in mourning for his lost dog, although eventually he did return to breeding poodles, although this time in his own way. He developed his own breed standard which differed from the kennel club's, and he was known to have very strong opinions when it came to poodles. For example, he thought it was ridiculous that bicolour poodles weren't accepted by the kennel club, and he still hated the conventional showing clips. And all of this led to him accruing something of a negative reputation in the poodle fancy, with many people choosing to distance themselves from him, seeing him as just a mad old man. But Pulaski didn't seem all too bothered. He was happy to just do his own thing, and also to sell his puppies for up to $3,000. With his pet shop closed, Pulaski attempted several other poodle-based business ventures alongside his breeding, one of which was to invent an indoor toilet for small dogs, which would fit under a bathroom sink and had an automatic flush. I think he viewed this as the next big thing, something that all owners of small dogs would be falling over themselves to buy, but unfortunately for him, that couldn't be further from the truth. No one was interested. He also dedicated himself to writing what was supposed to be his magnum opus, Pulaski on Poodles. This was to be a book which would share everything you could ever possibly want to know about the breeding and care of poodles, as well as a detailed history of the breed, and plenty of anecdotes about the lives of famous poodles. This, like his dog toilet, did not take off. His manuscript was rejected by publisher after publisher, until it became clear that no publishing house was ever going to take it on. The big publishing houses weren't interested, either feeling that it was too niche, or too similar to books they already had. And when he tried approaching smaller publishers, it didn't work out either, as he had these big visions of a high-quality showstopper of a finished work, and none of them could afford to make such a thing, and Pulaski sure as hell wasn't going to cheapen his dreams just to make them doable. So instead, he decided that the only way he was ever going to get this book out there was to take pre-orders and use that money to print it. It cost $10, and even Winston Churchill ordered a copy. He might be most heavily associated with British bulldogs, but he was actually super into poodles. However, despite Pulaski's enthusiasm, this book would also never materialise. Ultimately, Pulaski passed away at the age of 73, in the summer of 1968, having never found out what happened to his beloved masterpiece. So, let's round out this episode by talking about some of the theories behind Masterpiece's disappearance. I feel like a true crime podcaster. The first theory, the one that Pulaski seemed to most believe, was that Masterpiece had been stolen. But why? Well, there are several potential motives for that. Firstly, it could have been for ransom. Although we typically associate ransom kidnappings as being something that only happens to people, it's not actually unheard of for animals to be abducted instead if they're valuable enough. Probably the best known example of this, at least here in the UK, would be the theft of Shergar, a highly successful racehorse who was stolen and held for a ransom of £2 million, but that's a story for another episode, and actually one I've already got in the pipeline. On paper, the ransom theory would seem to make sense. It was well known how utterly devoted Pulaski was to Masterpiece. He clearly would have done anything to save him, including parting with his cash. But if that was the case, then why wouldn't the kidnapper ever send a ransom note? As far as we can tell, none were ever received, not by Pulaski or the police, not even any ones that turned out to be hoaxes. Maybe the thief didn't expect Masterpiece's disappearance to get so much attention, or for the authorities to be so involved, and they ended up being too scared to make contact. But then why not just return him and collect the cash reward? You could claim you just happened to find him, unless perhaps even that felt like too much of a risk. Yeah, I don't know, I don't really buy the ransom theory. So what other motives might there be for someone to steal Masterpiece? Well, some theorise that perhaps he could have been stolen to be sold on the black market. Or maybe that he just had a devoted fan who stole him for no other reason than that they wanted him for their own. That's certainly one of the better options here, that he lived out the rest of his days as a pampered pet. Or perhaps he was stolen by someone who had a grievance with Pulaski, although I couldn't find anything to suggest that he had any major enemies. I mean, yeah, he became disliked in the world of dog showing, but most of that didn't come about until long after Masterpiece went missing. Or maybe he was stolen by a rival dog breeder. Sure, they couldn't just rock up to a show with Masterpiece, people would recognise him, but they could have kept him hidden, used him for breeding, and just put a different name on the pedigree papers. I don't imagine that kind of fraud would be that hard, especially in the 50s. That way they could still have Masterpiece's offspring to compete with and sell, but without necessarily arousing suspicion. If Masterpiece was stolen and kept alive, then there were never any reported sightings of him. Though, given that this was 70 years ago now, I'm not sure how far word would have spread. I mean, yeah, he was an international celebrity, but I don't imagine many people outside of New York City would have been actively on the lookout for him. If you saw someone with a little grey poodle, you probably wouldn't assume that it was the famous one that disappeared. So it's entirely possible that if Masterpiece was stolen and kept alive, he was hidden away or taken somewhere else. Some people actually theorise that Masterpiece could have been spirited away to an entirely different continent. But then of course it's also entirely possible that Masterpiece wasn't stolen, that there was no criminal conspiracy here. He just wandered out of Poodle's Inc. of his own accord and for whatever reason never found his way home. I mean, he'd escaped twice before, once from the same store. Maybe this time he was found by someone who thought he was a stray and took him in, keeping him for the rest of his life as a beloved pet. Although if that was the case, you'd think the person who found him would have heard about his disappearance and made the connection. But perhaps they did and just didn't want to return him. Maybe they were too in love with him themselves to part with him, or maybe they thought he'd be happier living the life of a normal dog and not an anthropomorphized socialite. Which, to be fair, was probably true. But again, if someone local had suddenly started going about town with a brand new grey toy poodle, people probably would have noticed and said something. Perhaps Masterpiece escaped, and then simply lived out the rest of his days as a stray on the streets of New York. But he was, by all accounts, a very friendly dog. He wasn't scared of people, so it wouldn't have been in his character to avoid them. He would have sought them out, especially if he was hungry or cold or lonely, and in that case, someone probably would have then recognised him and cashed in the reward. Or perhaps he left of his own accord, and then something happened to him shortly after. Maybe then he was stolen, or hit by a car, or met with some other accident. Maybe something happened so soon after he escaped that no one realised who he was, and his body was disposed of without thought. And then the person responsible just never came forward because once they'd found out about Masterpiece's disappearance, they didn't want people to know what they'd done. This feels like the kind of case where there's no obvious answers. Every potential theory seems to have an equal number of pros and cons in its favour. The only solid piece of evidence we have was that he was seen leaving the shop in the company of a dark-haired woman. But who's to say that the person who reported that sighting wasn't lying, either because they wanted to be part of an exciting mystery or because they wanted to mislead the investigation away from themselves or someone they knew? Pulaski said that Masterpiece was so well trained, he would have obeyed anyone who gave him a command in the way you would at a dog show, which would explain why he was walking alongside her so obediently. But it's also possible that he just liked her. Maybe she'd given him a titbit or a stroke and hadn't realised that he was following her afterwards. It's entirely possible that this woman, whoever she was entirely innocent, and didn't come forward because either she didn't hear about the reported sighting of herself, or because she was worried about being implicated in something that was nothing to do with her. She may not have even seen Masterpiece as she left the store, or maybe she never came forward because she actually did have something to hide. This really is one of those cases that's just going to go down in history as an unsolved mystery. I don't think it's possible to find out the truth after so long, especially with nothing to go off. All we have is speculation. I honestly don't even know what I think is most likely. I don't really have any particular theory that I subscribe to here. But in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, I'm going to believe that Masterpiece simply wandered out of the shop of his own accord. Perhaps he was fed up of life as a socialite and wanted some peace, and that he ended up being found by someone who took him in and loved him and gave him the life he deserved. Not a life of decadent finery, but a life of playing outside and digging holes and just being a normal, happy dog, and that he lived out the rest of his days as a much-loved family pet. It's certainly the best possible outcome he could have had. But what do you think? Which of these theories do you think is the most plausible? Or do you have another one entirely that I haven't mentioned here? Either way, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about this mystery. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd Podcast. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, then it would mean the world to me if you could support us in any way. Leave us a positive rating or review in your podcast player, share it with your friends, like the video and leave a comment if you're listening via YouTube. All of those things really do make a massive difference. Any and all money made through this podcast goes to the Little Rescue Zoo, which is an animal sanctuary specialising in exotic pets and disabled animals. So by supporting the show, you're also supporting their work, which is literally saving animals' lives, and I think that's pretty cool. As always, I'll have all of my sources and everything linked in the show notes, but I also always like to give a shout out to anything that was like my main source for the episode. And when it comes to the more historical cases like this, finding reliable information is often not easy. Thankfully though, the American Kennel Club's 2-part coverage of this case was a massive benefit to me in my research phase, so obviously I want to give them a shout out here. And of course they'll be linked in the show notes. New episodes of the Animal Nerd Podcast come out every single Tuesday, plus bonus minisodes at least once a month, so be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an upload. Thank you again for listening, and I will see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!